All right, so this lecture is going to be about political development 1700s. Talk about French Revolution and a little bit about Napoleon, even though we'll cover a lot of that in the next lecture too. I'm going to quickly kind of jump through these. Look, I can't overstate to you the importance of changes here. So if you want to kind of just make sure that you're solid on this. A couple years ago, this was one of the SAQ questions. Was like, how did life change? Like, what was one difference between life before, like 1700, and one after 1700? I think something like that. So make sure you have a couple of these examples in your brain, and then obviously, like I told you in the video yesterday, that this agricultural revolution is going to be really important. I think in some ways on this test. And I hope that that's something that you know well and that we could write good essays about. All right, so let's get into the politics of the 1700s. All right, so I guess sort of broadly speaking here to start with, and then I'll kind of go country by country. When you talk about sort of broad trends, all right, so there's going to be the end of the Dutch Golden Age with the Peace of Utrecht. These wars with Louis XIV in the late 1700 or late 1600s and early 1700s, and then the Anglo-Dutch wars during the 1600s, and then just like competition from English shipping and merchants is going to weaken Dutch trading, and then also from the Peace of Utrecht, the English get the slave trade. And something again that I brought up in class, I always remember is that from the start of the slave trade in the late 1400s to 1713, about half of the total amount of slaves are going to be shipped. In they're not even a 100-year span, the other half is. So the English are going to utilize this and ship way more slaves. And obviously we'll talk a lot about how like the way that international relations trend in the 1700s has a lot to do with the wealth that the English are going to generate from the slave trade. So keep that in the back of your mind. The Netherlands are going to shift their economy more towards banking. They're the first country that are going to have. So as they kind of lose control of trading and trade networks around the world, they're the first country to have a useful paper currency. They're going to have a stock market in Amsterdam. And just like their central banking system is going to be the most advanced in Europe for quite some time. All right. The other sort of big trend is there's going to be sort of broadly speaking colonial wars that are going to start from the late 1600s all the way through 1815, and essentially what's going to happen. And there's going to be other players in this. So, when we talk about these wars, it's not going to be just Britain versus France all the time. But I think you should note that, like, for this over 100-year period, Britain and France are almost going to consistently be at war for long stretches of this. And so you could talk about how, like, the British are going to get the best of the French in almost every single one of these instances. And this is not only going to help propel the British Empire, but it's also going to help sort of accentuate like the different problems that were present in the French economy. And I think we're sort of, as the 1700s go on, you're going to kind of lead directly into the French Revolution. Some of the specific wars here that you would need to know is the War of Spanish Succession. Again, this is going to be important because largely of the slave trade, but I mean also just like the what could have happened here is also really important. So if France would have been able to merge the Spanish and French empires, I think like the what could have happened and what didn't happen is as important as what did happen in this regard. Then you have the War of Austrian Succession, which we'll talk about more later. But then the big one in the mid 18th century or 1700s is the 7 Years' War, in which Britain is going to win. And that essentially like cuts off or chokes off Britain's trading with the New World. And then British is going to also, so the British get Canada from this. They get the area between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. The French lose Louisiana to the Spanish. The British are also going to take control of all the French trading posts in India. And so this is sort of like the beginning of the British sort of tightening their grip and their control in India. And obviously, India becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire later on. But the war that kind of ended this, or the treaty that kind of ended this war, is the Treaty of Paris. This is something you really absolutely need to know. This is definitely the most important treaty since Westphalia. So, like I said, France is going to be removed from North America. They lost Canada, all that kind of stuff I just went over, okay? Yeah. All right, roll tide. All right, so Great Britain, okay? So I think many of the changes that you see in the early 1700s are going to be a result of or impact from the Glorious Revolution. So the Glorious Revolution, by creating this sort of constitutional system, is going to prevent an absolute monarchy from establishing. I think that you should see that throughout this early 1700s period, one of the biggest effects that is going to help also cause or also help Parliament grow its power is the fact that this Hanoverian dynasty of George I and II, and then George III as well, but those first two really didn't speak English very well. And so they're going to rely on the Prime Minister and Parliament to kind of run the country and run the politics of the country. And this is all while the British Empire is starting kind of to take shape in the early 1700s, all right? And so we're going to get to the point where in the mid 1700s, after the French and Indian War, George III is going to eventually dismiss William Pitt, which Pitt was probably one of the most powerful early prime ministers, I think you could probably say. And George III is going to try to basically re-strengthen the monarchy, but he's going to be largely unsuccessful. So Enlightenment ideas had spread. They had this sort of period of salutary neglect where it's hey, the king's not really doing anything. Parliament's kind of letting people run the show, and especially with American colonies. We'll talk about this more next year in APUSH. And so, George III tried to reassert, monarchical control, but largely is unsuccessful in the fact that, this is going to lead to the American Revolution, and then the colonists end up winning that revolution. Ultimately, just, British lose, a taste for strong monarchs. And so, I guess, then the whole story from there is that the British realized, hey, this is going to be a parliamentary, constitutional monarchy, but basically Parliament's going to run the government. And so basically the whole story from the late 1700s on is the very gradual, and I say very gradual, slow expansion of political participation amongst the British population. And so one of the big changes that happens in the end of the 1700s is that they start having elections for the House of Commons, which is the lower branch of Parliament. So the lower branch of Parliament is the House of Commons, and then the upper branch of Parliament is called the House of Lords. Kind of similar to what we have with the House of Representatives and then the Senate. Not exactly the same, but it's sort of. And these, this is going to be relevant because these elections in the House of Commons are not really going to be that noteworthy until we start having the growth of urban city centers, other than London, of course. And we'll talk about these sort of rotten boroughs that develop in really the beginning of the 1800s, I think, probably most strongly. Even though you are going to see some small effects of that, but not really until the early 1800s. I think in the other sort of big political trend, other than obviously we'll talk about the spread of enlightened political thought, is this how it has an effect on I guess what I was going to say is the enlightened political thought is it has an effect on the revolutions that happen between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but also has an effect on how absolutism and monarchies rule too. So we have a series of enlightened absolutists. So Frederick the Great in Prussia, Catherine the Great in Russia, and then Joseph II in Austria. And then I think you could maybe lump Napoleon into that category too. But some of like the similarities between all of these guys is that they're going to take steps forward in religious toleration. They're going to streamline legal codes so that like everything is clear and written. So it's kind of like a movement towards constitutionalism. They're going to increase access to education, and they're going to either reduce or eliminate torture and the use of death penalty. So those are like the similarities kind of across the board. And I think what's ironic about these absolutists putting these reforms in is that these kind of like sow the seeds of the eventual downfall of monarchies and absolutism to some extent for all of Europe. Now that's not going to happen really. So that big change doesn't really happen until after World War I. But the sort of beginning developments of that are going to all kind of start here, and that would actually be a really interesting essay. Honestly, is like to what extent were the growth of mass politics or like the destruction of monarchical forms of government brought about by changes during the 18th century. All right, so let's talk about Frederick. Okay, so obviously Frederick's going to be, all these guys are going to be strongly influenced by the Enlightenment. I mean, some more than others. I think like Frederick's probably in the middle of these three. Frederick does patronize Voltaire, meaning that like Voltaire lived in his court. Frederick's going to like strongly love French culture and learning, and he's going to sort of deem French culture and art and all that kind of stuff and fashion to be superior. Now, when you look at Frederick's reign, okay, so the first part of Frederick's reign is going to be largely dominated by war, and so you could argue that's not very enlightened. But ultimately was really good for Prussia. So like the fact that like Frederick does fight these wars, he's he's going to win both of them, and so it's like even in like the second, so in the 7 Years' War, Prussia should have been actually conquered, and because it was essentially like Austria, France, and Russia all kind of grouped up to like basically beat Prussia down. And what happens is that Peter III is going to create a deal with Frederick the Great and pulls Russia out of the war, which then allows Prussia to focus on Austria and France and is able to beat them. And that's actually what leads to Peter III's assassination, and Catherine, who was his wife, gets to take over. And a lot of people say she was actually involved in the assassination of Peter III, so that's always fun. But so Frederick's going to grow Prussia and Prussian power during the War of Austrian Succession, so he gets a big chunk of Austria, Silesia, and so you can have that. And so then, like in the second half of his rule, is largely a lot of the reforms that he brings about, and a lot of these reforms, at least in their intent, were meant to increase the power of the state. I mean, much like the wars that he fought. And I think maybe the one critique of Frederick's reforms is that like the peasants don't really benefit from them, but like overall, like he does open up Prussian society more. I mean, like I said, there's going to be moderate religious freedom, largely for economic reasons. So he invites like Polish Jews and French Huguenots to Prussia because they were rich. He's going to promote more education in schools and universities. He's going to improve the judicial system. He does free serfs on crown lands, so like he kind of removes serfdom from being a thing on royal lands. However, he uses those freed serfs as soldiers. He's going to improve state bureaucracy, reduce censorship, abolish the death penalty. He also, remember we talked about this in class, like he largely supported scientific agriculture. Like he's the one that brings potatoes to Prussia. So there's a lot of things here that he does well. You would just kind of be able to balance that with the fact that like these reforms don't affect the peasantry that much. I mean, maybe the biggest thing that helps them is the creation of like a Prussian schooling system, and also an expansion of the Prussian schooling system, And then like bringing the potatoes, I mean, does have real effects on the Prussian peasants because it improves their diets and all that kind of fun stuff. All right, so Catherine, she is probably the least enlightened, or at least I guess you'd want to qualify that. It's not that she's the least enlightened, and maybe that still is the fact of the matter, but she was the one that probably instituted enlightened ideas into her actual rule the least. And so, like she like Voltaire and Diderot did spend time in her court, and she loved French, everything France. So she like forced the nobility around her in her court to speak French, wear French clothing. They ate French food. They did everything France. But because of the effects of Pugachev's rebellion, kind of in the middle of her reign, Catherine needed to basically put down any kind of possibility that serfs were gonna like revolt again, and so she gave the nobility like absolute control of their serfs, which essentially like turns it into slavery. Like even so, like serfs didn't have a right to their life even. So like nobility could sort of freely kill peasants if they wanted to. She also is going to free nobles from taxes and confiscated church lands to distribute to nobles in exchange for their loyalty, which created economic problems like for the state to some extent down the road, which we'll talk about later. Now, some of the reforms that she did do, okay, so she's going to encourage the spread of printing presses. We've talked about that a lot. She bettered Russian education system, and especially for young women. She's going to restrict the use of torture only to specific things. She's going to allow some limited religious toleration. She strengthened local government. She actually tried to create like a new set of laws or a code of laws that was like enlightened, but the nobles in Russia refused basically to accept these new laws. And so like none of these things actually kind of went into effect. So I think that she did make some small changes, obviously, but like the big thing that happened to her rule is that like peasants lost a lot of rights, especially because you're talking about like 90+% of Russia would have been peasants, and so like the biggest effect of her rule for the most amount of people was that like hey, like they lost their rights. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind when you think about how enlightened she really was. With Joseph II, I think you maybe could talk about Maria Theresa being in this group. She ruled for a long period, from 1740 to 1780. And she didn't necessarily support Enlightenment thought, but like she also was pretty open to reform. So like it's kind of interesting to think about in that regard. Now, Joseph II is definitely the most enlightened of these three. However, he only rules for 10 years. So a lot of like Joseph's reforms don't stick long enough for people to become accustomed to and like basically force them to become part of society. Is that many of these reforms that Joseph's going to make are later going to be overturned by his brother. And so like things that he did, and like like the biggest one is he abolished serfdom while he was king. This was later overturned. He gave total freedom of religion and gave religious rights to religious minorities. He reduced the influence of the Catholic Church in Austria. He's going to allow freedom of the press. He's going to reform the judicial system, make it equal for everybody. He abolished torture and ended the death penalty. He expanded state-funded schools. He established state hospitals, poorhouses, and orphanages. And so, like, a lot of these reforms, at least for the brief period of his rule, made Austria a lot better. Now, again, the problem is that Joseph doesn't rule long enough, and that because Joseph's reforms had largely pissed off the nobility in Austria, like his brother Leopold needed to basically like trade to nobles and say like, hey, nobles, like if you support me and like if you'll go along with this like change from my brother to me, like I'll overturn a lot of these. And so that was essentially like the trade-off that Leopold made in order to like make sure the nobility followed once Joseph had died. All right, let's talk about the French Revolution, okay? And we talked about this class the other day. Um, when you talk about the causes of the French Revolution, I think you could do this a couple different ways. You could either do short-term and long-term causes. Um, you could also do like different causes based on like socioeconomic groups. So you could talk about how like um, many of the long-term causes were probably had more of an effect on like the middle class and the bourgeoisie wanting privileges and wealth and the status that came with like being a noble, and that like many long-term causes also had like an effect on like government debt. But I think like as and especially as French society became more literate in the 1700s, um, like the peasants became aware of the fact that like not only were they struggling and they struggled more and more, and taxes became more burdensome as the 1700s wore on. But there also was like a growing awareness of like the culture that had developed around Versailles, and that like the Parisians had developed a real um, like resistance to this idea of like, hey, like all of the people that are running the country are over in like all these nobles are over in Versailles, like eating these ridiculous meals, living this ridiculous lifestyle of basically opulence and craziness. And so like uh, it's not just like the short term thing for peasants. I mean, there had been sort of this growing like agitation of like how life was, especially as like Enlightenment thought had kind of filtered through society and had, in maybe some small ways, like lower classes became aware of like the ideas of Locke and Rousseau, and um, so I do think that there's a number of causes here at play, both short term, long term, and also like broke down by like socioeconomic classes. Um, and so like remember this whole thing starts out though like as like the middle class bourgeoisie part of this element of this revolution is what essentially kickstarts this whole thing. So in 1789, the French government's going to be on the verge of bankruptcy. The nobles in France, they're like, remember, Louis the 16th is going to try to institute tax reforms and tell the nobles that they're going to have to start paying taxes, and they basically say no thanks. Um, and so he called in the States General and was basically going to say like, oh, like you are gonna like pay taxes, like or like basically the French government's going to fall down. And at this like this Estates General, which is essentially like the French Parliament, um, the first and second estate basically try to rig the voting system to screw over the third estaters. And so the third estaters understand that they're getting like jobbed basically, and that's what leads to this whole like tennis court oath where they they basically lock themselves up and they say like we're you know the third estate is the ones that actually run the society and run the government, and like we are like basically the bedrock of French society. um, and remember this like this the pamphlet that what is the third estate had become very popular at this time. And so this third estate is going to declare itself the true National Assembly of France, like basically like the true representative body of France. And like that tennis court oath is basically like, hey, we're going to continue to meet as this National Assembly until we get a constitution. And so this whole first phase, this National Assembly phase of the French Revolution, is essentially like this weird mixture of like peasants revolting for food and better treatment, and also revolting to help kind of protect the National Assembly in this like fledgling revolution. And it's also like the third estate in a sort of legal sense of the way, like this bourgeoisie element of the third estate. Because remember, the third estate would have been like basically if you weren't an upper noble or a clergyman, it was basically everybody else. Um, so we're still talking at least 90% of the population, probably more, um, of people that like are revolting for a whole host of reasons. And so like when you start looking at these main important things that happen during the National Assembly, like some of them are lower class, some of them are this bourgeoisie element in this third estate. And so like the storming of the Bastille would have been lower class Parisians that felt like they needed to raid the king's armory and gunpowder deposits so that they could help protect this National Assembly from the King's army. But like there are legal elements of this. So like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is essentially like the French Bill of Rights. And this is what essentially like establishes what is what we become to like the bedrock of Western society. Like everyone's free and equal. Everyone has natural rights to liberty and property and security, and not to be oppressed. Women also during this time, women are going to gain important rights to property and divorce. But again, like we see these flare-ups of like lower class things. So like the Women's March to Versailles, that was a bunch of like poor women that worked in the fishing parts of Paris along the river, and they basically marched their way down to Versailles. They were tired of not having affordable food, and they basically kidnapped the king, and they basically kidnap the king and they march him back to Paris. And then the king stays in Paris until they execute him. Well, he tried to escape once, so he had a brief little spurt outside of Paris. They are also going to pass the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which there was an act that was passed that like took lands from the church, and that they also required the clergy in France to make an oath to the French government, which about half of the French clergy said, no, we're going to keep our oaths to the Catholic Church. And in 1791, they again kind of, I just had alluded to this, but the king tried to flee France and make his way to Austria, because that's where Marie Antoinette, who was the queen of France, she was Austrian, and so they were trying to get to Austria, and where they would be protected and supported. And so in this constitution, all right, they divided France into 83 departments that were governed by elected officials. They established the metric system. They abolished internal tariffs and guilds. And so, like, this is an important step forward. Now, unfortunately, once they created a constitution and they created these, basically the framework to elect officials, the government that is elected in this legislative assembly is very, very fractured. Okay, so there's conservatives or royalists, there's moderates, there's radicals. Even amongst the radicals, you have like different groups that will start to develop between like people that wanted to basically bring war to the rest of Europe once the war starts. And the war is really honestly the thing that like kind of makes the revolution become more radical, and there's more fanatical like attempts to sort of save the revolution against like these other outside forces that would try to kill it. And so what's going to end up happening in 1792 is that like the government's going to slowly during this phase become more influenced by the mob in Paris. And so like the mob is going to become more and more of a force. I think you see this in like the September massacres, where essentially like for a month the mob basically goes around Paris and like kills upper class nobles, and like they massacre like I think they kill like 2,000 people. You may want to Google that. I know they kill a ton of people, and they basically like most of like the upper class and nobility in France flees during that time, basically in reaction to like, hey, the mob's out of control, the government's not strong enough to basically tell the mob to go away and to put the mob down. And so they call for new elections. Now the problem is like the mob and the radicals are the ones that are basically wielding all the power, and so these elections lead to a very radical government. So this phase of from 1792 to 1795, like this national convention, is going to be predominantly like a radical, very liberal, lower class, true, I guess, democratic government to some extent, because of like it is going to really represent the like way more people than the National Assembly did or the Legislative Assembly ever did. Now, this newly elected National Convention, and because remember, the king had tried to escape, they also found in 1792 was the Bismarck Manifesto, I think it was called, where like they found out that the king had been trying to sabotage the revolution and was basically the king was writing letters to other kings and queens around Europe and basically like, hey, this is the best way to attack the France, and this is the best way to try to put down this revolution. Like, please come save us. And so they find out the king's basically trying to sabotage him, and that's when they put him on trial and they eventually execute him. Once they kill the king, that really causes a reaction around Europe and increases war basically with. So once they killed the king, like England, Spain, Holland are going to join in on the war against France. And so that war is, and the increase in war is going to cause more chaos and violence. And that, like in that sort of chaotic, violent environment, this is when the reign of terror starts. And essentially, it's like, hey, the government's got to get control of the mob. The government also has to get control of the war effort because now they're fighting a war against more countries. And so essentially, it's like total government control. And it's like either you're with us or you're against us type mentality. And so they kill basically all of their political opponents. They, and again, this is, we've talked a lot about this in class, but this is like Robespierre is in power now. But they basically get rid of all dissident, political opponents. They're gone. The government basically takes total control of the economy. So they make sure that the economy is growing enough food for everybody. They make sure the economy is providing enough like war goods. So bullets, guns, even like uniforms for troops, like all this stuff. So like the government basically like forces the economy to start to produce at maximum levels. They also do the levée en masse, which is like the first draft, and they like the army is going to grow to 1 million men, by far the largest army in all of Europe at that time. And so like this is like when we talk about Napoleon's success, a lot of this is built on like just like the raw power of in the amount of troops that the French army had. Now Napoleon was also a military genius, so a lot of like Napoleon's war tactics, like in cavalry tactics, were taught even like in West Point as like good military tactics all the way up to like World War II. So like that's like kind of keep like Napoleon is a great military leader in the sense that he's a military genius, but he also is like France had the largest army in the world. This reign of terror is also going to lead to the abolishment of slavery in French colonies, and this is kind of like the leads into like the most important thing or most controversial thing that's going to come up is like how this interacts with like Haitian history, like in Haiti. This reign of terror was also very anti-Catholic because of it, like the Catholic Church's ties to nobility and the king. So they create a new like state religion, which was called the Cult of Supreme Being. They create a new revolutionary calendar. Now, eventually, this is all gonna like go too far. So because Robespierre kills too many people and it's too much government and it's too much like basically well, I'm not sure it's totalitarian. Like you could probably make that argument. Like that's probably somewhere close to it. Eventually, this just becomes too much government, too much like killing, and like the Thermidorian reaction is like when they like kill Robespierre, and ends the radical phase of the French Revolution. This phase is going to be replaced by the Directory, which now this Directory, like this is kind of crazy to say, but like because it's a moderate middle class, like it actually was pretty weak because like the biggest groups of Frenchmen either wanted the government to be more radical and more liberal, or they wanted like kings to come back, and so like it was problematic that it wasn't one way or the other because you'll see like lower classes are going to try to upstage a uprising, royalists are going to try to upstage uprising, and And so like this government was never really very strong, even though it lived or existed for 4 years. And I think like the biggest thing that probably allowed it to exist for 4 years is um, Napoleon is basically kicking everybody's butt across Europe and also in Egypt. And so like Napoleon's successes in war are able to be like nationalistic propaganda in order to try to get people to be like more in support of this revolutionary government, even though many people were unhappy with how moderate it was. Now, eventually this gets to the point where like the government was so unstable that this Absolutists guy that is the one that wrote What is the Third State, he also like invites Napoleon to join some conspirators, and they overthrow the government, which established this consulate period. Now, this consulate period is where Napoleon is not an emperor yet, and this is where like Napoleon is extremely popular. So the government is strong enough to basically maintain security for all people. Napoleon gives people enough rights and privileges for them to be happy. The economy also starts doing much better. And so like this is largely defined by like a very good time in French history. So Napoleon is going to do a lot of things as far as like he creates the Bank of France, which bettered the economy. He's going to create public education system so that like all people started going to school. He's going to put the Catholic Church back in place, so like this was like very popular. He passed the Napoleonic Code, which gave people a lot more rights and privileges. Maybe the one drawback is that like women don't get equal status in the Napoleonic Code. And so like this is like Napoleon does a lot of good things early on. Now the problem is that like Napoleon gets power hungry, and eventually Napoleon's going to crown himself emperor. And once he crowns himself emperor, he's going to go on another like war crusade. And so like basically Napoleon tries to like his whole claim was that he was freeing the rest of Europe from control of these like old kings who like repressed people's rights and privileges. And so like he largely does that. Now at what cost, I guess you could ask. He creates this sort of grand empire, which he spreads the Napoleonic Code, which does ultimately is like a good thing. Now the problem is that like people start rejecting French control, and so in order to try to like repress like this like anti-French control, like he's got to become more oppressive, and so like it ultimately kind of like goes against the Napoleonic Code, a lot of like the governments that he puts in place. He also puts the continental system in, which like tried to prohibit all of the continental countries from trading with Britain. This is ultimately a failure. It makes Britain stronger, helps British industrialize quicker as they become more self-reliant and more develop stronger relationships with their colonies. And then ultimately just like pisses off European countries. So like they don't like Napoleon telling them what to do politically and putting his relatives in power, and then like telling them what to do economically. Like this is ultimately not good. Napoleon ends up figuring out that the Russians were breaking the continental system, and so he tries to invade Russia, which is all kind of part of this downfall. Now, like we will talk about how like Napoleon interacts with his Congress of Vienna in the next video. All right, that's all I got today, kids. Merry Christmas.